All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the second set of ExoExplorer talks. Really appreciative of you joining us today. I hope you're taking care of yourselves. So for those who don't know me, my name is Tiffany Kataria. I'm the chair for the Exoplanet Explorer Science Series. So as I said, thanks for attending the second set of talks. So I always start these talks with just a preamble about what the program's about. So the Exoplanet Explorers or ExoExplorer Science Series, which is sponsored by NASA's Exoplanet Exploration Program, aims to enable the professional development of a cohort of graduate students and postdocs and exoplanet researchers, dubbed ExoExplorers. Each member of the cohort is featured in a webinar such as this that will be live streamed as it is now to the live exoplanet community, helping to increase their visibility in the field. The cohort also learns from the experiences of established exoplanet researchers in the field called Exo Guides via a combination of tailored presentations and small group discussion. So this fifth cohort is currently running from January to June and is composed of 10 excellent early career scientists. If you want to learn more about the program and the cohort, one of our organizing committee members should be putting something in the chat, or if not, I will. It's my pleasure today to introduce our two speakers. But before I do that, just some general ground rules. First, a reminder to behave professionally in this forum. Secondly, we plan to save questions until the end of each talk. So please either use the Zoom chat to type your question, or you can use the raise hand tool, which I believe is under the React functionality on the Zoom tool. All right, with that, I'll get started. Our first speaker is Emma Turtelboom. Emma is a graduating PhD student at UC Berkeley, working with Professor Courtney Dressing. During her PhD, she has used transit and radial velocity observations to perform both single system and population level analyses of multi-planet systems. This autumn, she will be starting as a William and Caroline Herschel postdoctoral fellow at McMaster University and is interested in understanding planet formation efficiency as a function of stellar mass during her postdoc. And with that, take it away, Emma.
All right, thank you. I will go ahead and share my screen. Okay, so hopefully you can all see this.
Yep.
Yeah, thank you for the introduction and for the opportunity to share some of my recent work with you all. I worked on this project with my collaborators, Jamie Dietrich, who's here. Hi, Jamie. Courtney Dressing and Caleb Harada. And our aim was not only to search for additional planets in known TESS multi-planet systems, but really to understand whether our models of planetary system architectures are descriptive of the full exoplanet population. Before I dive into the specifics of the project, I want to zoom out a little to the sort of motivating question underlying, I think, a lot of people on this Zoom call's work, namely, is our solar system unique? If we're interested in understanding how Earth formed and evolved, we have to study the other solar system planets, not only for their own sakes, which they absolutely should be understood for, but also for how they impacted Earth throughout the solar system's history and how they may have impacted Earth's habitability. So, for example, when we look at this plot, we see, image, obviously not to scale, but we see that our solar system, we have these four sort of inner rocky planets, then we have our gas giants, and then our ice giants. And we know that Jupiter likely played a critical role in the formation of sort of the inner rocky planets and their current locations, and sort of where they've ended up. I think this is something that any of us with siblings can probably relate to. The environment you grow up in and the siblings or planets you grow up around really impact who you become and how you evolve. And so in order to understand planet formation and evolution, we need to account for the influences of planets on each other in multi-planet systems and in our solar system, not only individual planets. And metrics of system architecture are sort of our way to capture these sort of very diverse physical processes that go on during the disk phase of planet formation and beyond. And this sort of system level approach has been used in planetary science for a long time. An example is the Titius-Bode law, which describes the sort of semi-major axes ratio between adjacent planets in our solar system. It was found that, each semi-major axis is, roughly a factor of 2 larger than the previous one. And that breaks down sort of in the outer solar system, but is just an example of how we can use these metrics of system architecture to connect planets across large distance scales within a given system, since they do obviously all impact one another. And architectures, when I say architecture, system architecture, that can mean a whole variety of things. In this talk, I'm mostly going to focus on orbital period distributions, but we can think of mass ratios, radius ratios, mutual inclination distributions, and what have you. And really, all of these different metrics allow us to sort of try and understand that underlying question of, are other planetary systems like our own? And it seems that so far the answer is maybe not. And this is something that's been shown to us by the Kepler mission, of course, alongside many other facilities, but the Kepler mission has given us this really fantastic sample of confirmed planets that I'm showing here plotted in pink, with confirmed planets found by other facilities in yellow, as well as the solar system planets in green, and orbital period on the x-axis, planet radius on the y-axis. And this really large population has allowed us to do these really interesting demographic studies to try identify trends in, along various axes, and sort of create models that describe exoplanetary systems. And, one of the big results that we, among many, is that most exoplanets appear to be in multi-planet systems, much like our own solar system, but a lot of exoplanets do not have solar system analogs. So, we don't have a hot Jupiter in our solar system. We don't have a sub-Neptune sized planet or a super Earth sized planet, kind of by kind of construction in their naming. But that kind of begs the question of, okay, well, how do those planets play into the likelihood of an Earth or an Earth analog developing? And so we can try and create these models to understand what types of systems exist and how they are similar or dissimilar to the solar system. Where do we fit in that picture? And another sort of benefit of this really huge population of exoplanets that we now have is that we can sort of use this large number to slice and dice and not only develop these models of planetary systems, but also try to evaluate their accuracy. And in this work, I specifically used the TESS sample to test whether the Kepler models, so the models based on this Kepler sample of multi-planet systems, whether those models are generalizable to the wider exoplanet population. And so TESS is, the successor mission to Kepler K2, in that it's this large transit survey. And TESS has currently observed around 183 multi-planet systems, hosting 369 planets and planet candidates. And we can use this sample to try and answer these questions of, can we use Kepler results to predict additional planets in TESS systems? And additionally, we can ask, where are additional planets in multi-planet systems most likely to be found? And this is interesting not only because, we have limited observational resources, we want to try and maximize our scientific output for, some given time input, but also we want to understand where additional planets are and sort of really develop these cohesive models of these interplanetary systems as we move to synthesized demographic surveys where we're trying to tie in populations of planets discovered by other complementary methods like astrometry or microlensing. Before we start trying to tie together inner and outer systems, we want to be confident that our models of the inner systems are accurate. And so in this project in particular, we looked at two different models of orbital period distribution in multi-planet systems. Firstly, the period ratio model and the clustered period model. And I'll kind of introduce both of those now. So the first model that we considered, again, based on this Kepler sample of multi-planet systems, the period ratio model. This was first introduced in Models et al. 2018. And sort of the picture of these types of systems, you can see this little cartoon at the bottom of the slide. These systems are described by having the innermost planet orbital period drawn from a distribution that peaks strongly at 10 days. It's a broken power law. But if we try and connect that to sort of the underlying physical picture that we think might be going on here, you can think of this as maybe being representative of the inner edge of a protoplanetary disk, where you have this cavity that's being sort of excavated by stellar radiation, acting as a trap that sort of halts migration. And then once we have that sort of inner anchor planet, the planets moving out in orbital period space are evenly spaced in log period space. And this is sort of inhibits inhabits, excuse me, a sort of similar architecture to the sort of peas in a pod style systems that you may be familiar with, where we see these typically very uniform systems in both mass and radii, again, in the Kepler sample. And in general, we can think of these period ratio model systems as being sort of ordered and uniform. And then the second model we considered, the clustered period model, this was put forth by Matthias He et al. In 2019. And this model asserts that the Kepler multis are best described by this sort of these clumps or clusters, as the name suggests, of planets in orbital period and also in radius space. And so in this cartoon representation you see on the right-hand side from the original paper, you can see examples of sort of a non-clustered system, a system with clustered planets in period space, and then a system with clustered periods and radii. And these two models are kind of widely used to describe compact multi-planet systems, but they're empirical models, as I mentioned, they're based on the Kepler sample. And so I wanted to see if that sort of, is that assumption valid? Can we, are these models descriptive of all compact multis? And so to do that, we can use TESS. And we want to understand if a model is not only descriptive of the population it's based on, but also predictive. If it's overly descriptive, we've overfit our data. And so in order to do that, this work was sort of motivated by the DYNAMITE framework, which was introduced by Jamie and Daniel Apai in 2020. And in this work, what they did was they took the 52 TESS multi-planet systems known at the time. Obviously, we have many more now, and we look at those as well in our paper. But for the purposes of today's talk, I'll just focus on this 2020 sample of 52 multi-planet systems. And they integrated over probability density functions in period, radius, and inclination, returning some posterior probability distributions. And in effect, what they did was predict an additional planet in each system under both the period ratio model and the clustered period model. And so then now what we can do is use these predictions alongside the additional TESS observations that have been carried out since 2020 to evaluate the accuracy of these predictions. And so kind of looking at this workflow overall, you can think of what we're doing as, we have some data, in this case, the Kepler sample. We've, folks have used this to generate these descriptive models of exoplanetary systems. From these models, we can generate predictions. Here I'm just showing, little representations of the posterior probability distributions for orbital period under the two models. And then with these predictions, we can use additional data, in this case, additional test data, to evaluate, is our model predictive? Are these models appropriately predictive? If the answer is yes, fantastic, we can go get ice cream and, pat ourselves on the back. If the answer is no, we can, still get ice cream and pat ourselves on the back, like why not? But we can make this into an iterative process where all this is telling us is that we need to kind of adjust our models to encompass the variability that we're seeing in this new population that we're trying to include. And so now I'll show you what that looks like for a single system. So specifically TOI 1246, this is sort of a cartoon representation of what we knew of this system in 2020. Cast your mind back. We did not know how crazy things were going to get, but in 2020, our understanding of this system was that it's a sort of relatively quiet K-dwarf that hosted 3 sub-Neptune-sized planets with orbital periods of around 4 days, 6 days, and 18 days. And DYNAMITE, under the period ratio model, predicted an additional planet in this system at around 10.4 days, and the clustered period model predicted an additional planet at around 14 days. But when we looked at this system in 2022, in the discovery paper, which I led, we found actually neither model was fully accurate. And we found an additional planet at 38 days instead. And this sort of begged the question, okay, well, what does this look like for the whole TESS population? In this system, we can do this on a case-by-case basis, but we thought it was really interesting to try and see if this was the case for all the TESS multis. And so that's what I'm showing here. In these two plots, on the x-axis, we have orbital period. On the y-axis, we have those 52 TESS multis that were known in 2020. the gray circles are the known TOIs, the known planets and planet candidates in 2020. And in the yellow sort of bars are showing the peak of the posterior probability distribution for each of these systems returned by DYNAMITE. And this, looking at these as these plots, we can see some sort of initial qualitative differences between the predictions under the two models. The clustered period model is tending to predict additional planets at shorter orbital periods, sometimes even sort of interior to the innermost known transiting planet in the system. Whereas the period ratio model is really trying to create this sort of ordered spacing where if there's sort of a gap where it's dynamically feasible to host an additional planet, the model kind of wants to put one in there. And so the period ratio model predictions are typically at longer orbital periods. And so with these predictions in hand in 2020, we really lucked out that TESS continued to observe and has reobserved its full field of view since 2020. All 52 of these systems have an extended TESS baseline. Here I'm showing a histogram of the number of sectors for each of those systems. And indeed, in 22 of those systems, additional planets and planet candidates have been identified. And so what we can do is see, okay, we have our predictions, we have some new planets. Do they match up? And so here I'm showing those same plots, but now in blue, I'm adding the newly discovered planets since 2020. And there, are 24 new transiting planets. And as kind of a zeroth order check of the kind of accuracy of these predictions, we can look at just sort of an overlap. If a model predicts an additional planet at period P, we find an additional planet at period P, fantastic, we have a match. And if we do this kind of counting exercise, we find that the clustered period model matches 4 newly detected planets, and the period ratio model matches 8 newly detected planets. And first off, this kind of begs the question, all right, well, why don't we see more matches? Why aren't more of these kind of new planets where we expect them to be? But also, I think we need to add a little nuance to this question of what does it mean for a prediction to be accurate? Because a model can be accurate in many different ways. And so here I'm showing on the top, the clustered period model, the bottom, the period ratio model. In black, we have the DYNAMITE posteriors. So on the x-axis orbital period, on the y-axis relative likelihood. And in green, you can see the 3 planets that were known in this system. I think this is TOI 175, that were known at the time in 2020. And in blue, we can see the new planet that was discovered in the system since 2020. I can't remember exactly when this one was published. But we can try and evaluate, okay, both of these models seems to have done all right, but how exactly do we define an accurate prediction? How do we kind of evaluate our model accuracy? So there's different ways to do this. And firstly, we can think, okay, is it at the right period? And in this case, both of these models have non-zero relative likelihood of an additional predicted planet at the period of the new planet. There's, some non-zero overlap. Fantastic. As a second sort of check, we can ask, is the new planet near the maximum peak, the most likely location for a new planet? And in this case, the period ratio model, that bottom panel, you can see that actually the highest relative likelihood for an additional planet was at around 5 days, whereas the new planet was actually found at 14 days. And finally, this one's sort of a little more nuanced, but a model can be correct by assigning some regime of period space as having 0 likelihood of a new planet or an additional planet. And then when we go look, we do in fact find that there are no planets there. And this requires us to understand our detection sensitivity. Obviously, TESS has a very different sort of observing pattern to Kepler. So these different systems received very different sort of numbers of sectors of TESS observations. And so we need to quantify our ability to detect the additional predicted planets in each case. The way we do that is using transit injection and recovery. This method allows us to sort of quantify our sensitivity to planets of a given size and a given period and what have you. And so here on the left-hand side, I'm just showing this as sort of just a toy model. the left-hand sort of column, I have a sort of synthetic light curve of a very well-behaved star, and below it, the Lomsgagel periodogram of that light curve, where we see this really strong sort of rotational feature that, synthetic. Then in the middle column, we see a synthetic transit, sort of set of transits of a planet of, in this case, Jupiter size, orbital period of 6 days. And when we kind of inject that synthetic transit signal into our light curve, and then we process it, we flatten it, we do our sort of blind planet search, we want to evaluate whether we're able to recover, i.e. detect that planet injected signal. In this case, if you look at the rightmost column, those 3 transits are still like super clear even by eye, and also in the box least squares, the BLS periodogram, below, you can also see this really strong peak at 6 days. And so in this case, we would say that we're able to recover this injected planet, i.e. we are sensitive to detecting a planet of this size and period in our light curve. Of course, most of the time it doesn't look like this, looks a little bit more like this, where we potentially have a lot more photometric jitter or stellar activity or what have you. And we're interested in looking for smaller planets, in this case, a Neptune-sized one. So our transits are going to be a lot shallower. And so in this case, if we look at the rightmost column, we absolutely do not see those transits by eye in the light curve. And if we look at the periodogram below, we don't see any strong sort of power at around 6 days. So in this case, we would say that the planet is not recovered. And so we can do this over and over again. We can, drawing from our prior distributions on planet period, planet radius, eccentricity, inclination, what have you. And that's what we did for all of our predicted additional planets under both models. And what these tests showed is that the clustered period model predictions were, on the whole, more detectable. We're more likely to detect them in our current set of test data. So here in these 2 plots, I'm showing again in the gray circles, the known planets in 2020, and the squares, which are shaded from sort of white to this deep pink, are the predicted additional planets shaded according to their recovery fraction. Where if you see this sort of deep pink square, that means that if this predicted planet does exist, and if it does transit, we should expect to detect it in our test data. Whereas if you see sort of a white square, that means that even if this planet is real, even if it transits, we're not going to be able to see it regardless. And so sort of on a population level, we can see that the clustered period model on the whole is more detectable. And this is sort of intuitive in the sense that the predicted additional planets under this model are typically at shorter orbital periods. You can imagine we would have more transits, we're going to get a higher SNR, we're more likely to detect them. But what we can do with this information is sort of modulate the evaluation of model performance that we did earlier to take into account our detection sensitivity. And so when we take this into account, we find that the period ratio model describes TESS multi-planet systems more accurately than the clustered period model. But that being said, the TESS sample is not well described by either model. And this is, I think, really interesting because it tells us that these multi-planet systems are complex. They are challenging to characterize, and their architectures are not necessarily as straightforward. We want to try put things in boxes. Turns out the universe is not very cooperative. And so I think sort of moving forward, I think we need to try and, improve these models of our system architectures. And there's many sort of ways to do that. Firstly, we can study other metrics of system architecture. So in this paper, I didn't talk about it today, but we also looked at sort of truncation of these multi-planet systems. We looked at dynamical packing. And, if you're interested to hear more about that, I'm more than happy to take questions on it. We can also add nuance to our models, for example, incorporating non-circular orbits. This is something that was done in Dietrich et al. 2022, and we see some modest improvement in the model performance when we do that. And then finally, which I think is a really exciting sort of avenue to go down, is we can not only compare our observed architectures, we can not only use these empirical models, which are based on, the data that we have, but we can also look at planet formation models that are based on sort of our underlying physical understanding of what is might be going on in protoplanetary disks and these systems as they form and evolve. And this is sort of a direction I'm really interested in going, kind of exploring more during my postdoc. But yeah, with that, I'll wrap up. This paper is on arXiv if you're interested in reading it or learning more, and it will be resubmitted. I mean, maybe this afternoon if I get my act together. If not, maybe on Monday, we'll see. But yeah, with that, I'll say thank you so much for your time and attention, and I will take any questions you have.
Thanks so much, Emma. Feel free to use React tools if you'd like to applaud. All right, time for questions. Okay, so Nick already put a question in the chat. Is there any bias due to the age of each system? I mean, system architectures can change over time, including gravitational instability that leads to ejected planets. What impact might the dynamical evolution of planetary systems have on the possible architectures you expect to find in a given system?
Ooh, that's a really interesting question. So ages are not something we've looked at in detail in this sample, just because getting ages for the majority of these would be tough. And this is certainly not a homogeneous sample in the sense that like we're not trying to make some argument this is a volume complete or anything like that. This is just the sample of TESS multis. Absolutely, I think that system architectures will change with time. Oh, sorry, my Zoom has disappeared. There you are. And I think that, recent work has shown by Fei Dai et al. Has shown that it seems that young systems are in resonance much more often than older systems. And so I think it will be really interesting to kind of try and understand how those resonances must be breaking, and we must be moving away from those with time. But yeah, it's not something we looked at in detail here.
Okay, thanks, Emma. Any other questions? Shubham, go ahead.
Thank you. My question was regarding the input sample, and if you could replicate something like this for non-transiting planets, where you might have many more multi-planet systems through radial velocity surveys, and if this predictive approach has been tested to your knowledge, or would that be an interesting path forward?
Yeah, absolutely. And I know that's something that Jamie has been working on, sort of incorporating into DYNAMITE, looking at radial velocity systems. And also, I think that a lot of these, I think a possible sort of continuation of this work is a lot of these systems, especially the TESS ones, since they're brighter, they're more likely to have radial velocity observations. And so we can go and look and see, okay, an additional planet was predicted at, whatever orbital period. We don't see anything in TESS. What about in RVs? Let's go look and see if they are there. They're just not transiting. So yeah, I absolutely think that's an additional set of data that's going to be really interesting to look at.
Right. All right. Thanks again, Emma. With that, I think we'll move on to the next speaker.